She did not conquer the world with an army, nor did she discover it with a compass. Yet the modern world as we know it began the moment Isabella of Castile chose to believe in a future no one else could see, because in a court dimmed by exhaustion, debt, and the long shadow of civil war, she made a financial decision so audacious that it would redraw maps, reroute rivers of silver, and bind distant continents into a single system of power, driven not only by steel and faith, but by credit, risk, and calculation. And to understand how a woman born into a fractured medieval kingdom became one of the most consequential financiers in human history, we must step back into a brutal age where legitimacy was purchased as much as inherited, where crowns survived on the strength of their treasuries, and where Isabella learned early that survival itself was an economic act. She was born in 1451 into a Castile torn apart by factional violence, a land where noble families maintained private armies, royal authority was openly defied, and the crown's finances were so unstable that coinage lost value and trust in governance evaporated. And as a young girl watching her half-brother Henry IV struggle to rule, Isabella absorbed a lesson few monarchs ever truly mastered: that power without financial control was an illusion. That sovereignty depended not merely on bloodlines or declarations, but on the ability to enforce contracts, collect taxes, and command loyalty through stability rather than fear. As the world adjusted to the reality she helped create, a reality in which ambition required funding, expansion demanded credit, and the fate of millions could hinge on a single financial decision made by a woman who understood that to rule was to calculate, and to calculate was to shape the future. And it is at this point, as the machinery of empire accelerated and the echoes of Isabella's choices grew louder, that the full weight of her legacy becomes clear, not as legend or myth, but as structure, as system, as a framework that still governs the way power moves through the world today. Because long after the banners faded and the crowns passed on, the financial logic Isabella of Castile embraced continues to define how history is made. It is that she grasped a truth that remains with us still, that the world is changed less often by battles than by bets, and that those who dare to finance the future, to stake resources on an unseen tomorrow, are the ones who quietly decide the shape of history. And it is from this understanding, forged in the crucible of 15th century Castile, that the modern world began to emerge, propelled forward by a queen who saw beyond the limits of her age and chose to invest in the unknown. And as we follow the consequences of that choice across oceans and generations, we begin to see how the logic she embraced would redefine power itself, turning kingdoms into states, voyages into markets, and belief into balance sheets, a transformation that would continue long after her death. It is the story of a ruler who understood that history itself could be financed, that the future could be invested in, and that by committing resources to an uncertain horizon, she could alter the trajectory of humanity, a realization that would echo through the centuries as empires rose, markets expanded, and the modern world took shape in the wake of a decision that transformed risk into destiny and credit into conquest. And as the silver fleet sailed and the ledgers filled, the balance between faith and finance that Isabella had mastered began to define an era in which power was measured not only in territory, but in flows of capital, a lesson that would be learned and relearned as the structure she created spread outward, shaping not just Spain, but the global system itself. And in the end, what makes Isabella extraordinary is not that she ruled in a man's world, or that she achieved what few women of her age could. It is here, in the tension between intention and outcome, that Isabella's legacy becomes most complex. because the queen who financed the modern world did so not as a dreamer intoxicated by novelty, but as a realist navigating the brutal economics of her age, balancing faith with calculation, morality with necessity, and ambition with constraint. And to follow the arc of her reign is to watch the medieval world dissolve into something recognizably modern, where states rose and fell not merely by the sword, but by their ability to manage debt, project credit, and organize power at scale. And as Isabella's successors inherited both her triumphs and her burdens, they would discover that the machinery she built could generate immense wealth, yet demanded constant discipline, for without restraint, abundance could corrode the very foundations it enriched. And thus, the story of Isabella of Castile is not simply the tale of a queen who backed a voyage. And so Isabella of Castile stands not only as a monarch or a symbol of faith, but as one of history's most consequential architects of power through money. A woman whose ledger entries reshaped the world as profoundly as any battlefield victory, proving that the modern age was not born solely through steel and sails, but through calculation, courage, and the willingness to invest in the unknown. And as the 16th century dawned and Spain's reach extended across oceans, the structures Isabella built began to strain under the weight of abundance. For the influx of precious metals brought not only wealth, but volatility, distorting prices, reshaping labor, and binding Europe ever more tightly to distant lands. Consequences she could not have fully foreseen, yet which flowed inevitably from the system she set in motion. A system in which capital moved faster than armies, and decisions made in royal courts reverberated across continents. She died in 1504, just as silver from the Americas began to pour into Spain, placing the kingdom on the brink of becoming the world's first global superpower. Her achievements already mythologized and contested, praised as visionary and condemned as ruthless. But regardless of moral judgment, the financial reality remains undeniable. She transformed a fractured medieval realm into a centralized state capable of underwriting exploration, sustaining prolonged war, and projecting power across oceans. And in doing so, she helped invent the economic logic of empire, where states invest, risk, and profit on a planetary scale. And when we speak today of venture capital, sovereign debt, and state-backed expansion, we are tracing lines back to decisions made in candlelit chambers by a queen who understood that the future belonged not merely to those who ruled land, but to those who could finance ambition. As her reign continued, she pressed forward with reforms that reduced noble autonomy, strengthened royal councils, and expanded bureaucratic governance. Actions often remembered solely through the lens of religious policy, but inseparable from her economic strategy, because uniform law, standardized taxation, and centralized authority were in her mind the pillars of fiscal stability. And while her policies toward religious minorities remain among the most controversial aspects of her legacy, they were driven in part by her conviction that fragmented loyalties weakened state power. And economic, a belief widely shared in an age where unity was equated with survival, and as European rivals watched Spain's influence expand, they did not merely see a devout queen or a victorious monarch, but a ruler who had unlocked the relationship between credit, conquest, and control, establishing precedents that future empires would refine and replicate. And yet, Isabella herself never lived to see the full consequences of her gamble. She ensured the crown retained sovereignty while offering rewards tied to success, effectively creating an early model of profit-sharing imperial finance. And when Columbus returned with news of lands beyond the horizon, Isabella did not surrender to celebration, but moved swiftly to secure legal and economic dominance. Negotiating papal authority, asserting exclusive trading rights, and establishing administrative mechanisms to regulate future expeditions, because she understood that discovery without governance was meaningless, and that wealth flowed not from land alone, but from systems capable of extracting, taxing, and regulating it. And under her direction, Spain developed institutions to oversee trade, mint currency, and manage colonial administration, laying the groundwork for bullion flows that would soon transform European economies. And though these systems would later unleash inflation and exploitation on an unprecedented scale, in Isabella's time, they represented a remarkable act of state planning, a recognition that empire required accountants as much as soldiers. He carried a proposal, already rejected by Portugal and dismissed by many as reckless fantasy, a plan to sail westward into an uncharted ocean in search of Asia, demanding ships, crews, titles, and a share of all future profits. And what separates Isabella from the rulers who turned him away was not blind faith but calculated foresight, because she evaluated his proposal not as a dream but as a strategic investment. Recognizing that Portugal's dominance of African trade routes threatened Castile's economic future and that remaining confined to traditional commerce would condemn her kingdom to stagnation. And though the treasury was exhausted from war, Isabella understood that the cost of inaction might exceed the cost of risk, that refusing to invest in the unknown could leave Castile permanently behind its rivals. And so, she made a decision that would echo across centuries, treating exploration as venture capital backed by the authority of the crown. And, contrary to legend, she did not pawn her jewels in desperation, but leveraged royal credit, negotiated contracts, and structured Columbus's agreement to balance incentive with control. She cultivated relationships with financiers, protected merchants from noble predation, encouraged trade across cities and ports, and negotiated loans with an awareness that creditworthiness itself was a form of power, a reputation that could determine whether a state survived crisis or dissolved into chaos. And nowhere was this more evident than in her handling of the long and expensive war against the Emirate of Granada, a conflict that drained resources for over a decade, yet did not bankrupt Castile because Isabella resisted the temptation to debase currency or mortgage the future, instead relying on disciplined taxation, forced loans from elites, ecclesiastical contributions, and meticulous control of expenditure, proving that sustained military ambition could be financed without destroying the economic foundations of the state. And when Granada finally fell in 1492, Isabella stood not merely as a conqueror completing the Reconquista, but as a ruler who had demonstrated a new model of governance, one where war, administration, and finance were fused into a coherent system of state power. And it was in that same pivotal year, with soldiers returning home and coffers strained, that a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus appeared once more at court. When she married Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469, the union was not a fairy tale, but a calculated consolidation of resources, a merger that bound Castile's immense agricultural wealth to Aragon's Mediterranean trade networks, creating a political and financial partnership that allowed Isabella to pursue something radical for her time: the centralization of power through the centralization of money. And although the two ruled jointly, it was Isabella who asserted authority over Castile's treasury, taxation, and internal administration, reclaiming lands illegally seized by nobles, reforming courts so debts could be enforced and contracts honored, stabilizing currency to restore confidence, and restructuring taxation so revenue flowed back to the crown rather than disappearing into aristocratic pockets. Actions that provoked resistance but ultimately transformed Castile from a feudal battleground into a functioning state, because Isabella understood that a kingdom was not held together by oaths alone, but by systems that made order profitable and rebellion ruinous. Her reign unfolded at a turning point in European history. When the medieval economy was giving way to early capitalism, when merchant banks, maritime trade, and credit instruments were reshaping politics, and Isabella positioned her kingdom to adapt rather than collapse,